now also. So hello everybody. Sorry for not speaking in Spanish to you. I understand Spanish, but it's a little bit rusty, and I'm therefore not able to give such a presentation in Spanish language. Please tell me if you have difficulties in understanding me, and remind me to speak clearly and slowly when necessary. So you should now be able to see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I am planning to talk something like 45 minutes, and then we would have time for a discussion. But if there are some things unclear, feel free to interrupt me also within the presentation. What I would like to present to you are mainly some outcomes from a European project that I had the pleasure to lead a few years ago. The project has ended already, something like I think 4 years ago, but was a project that is very close to my heart and that has been very defining for my research. Therefore, I'm still very happy to talk about this project. Here you see kind of the logo of this project. It was called Hercules, a European Union funded project. And well, Aaron, you introduced me as a landscape researcher. That's correct. I have a degree in landscape ecology. The challenge that people in landscape research have is that we are working on many important topics about sustainability, sustainable land use, and so on in our research. But there are rarely funding opportunities, research projects that are explicitly dedicated to landscapes. Usually we have to go into areas and have to go into agricultural research projects, forest research projects, other things about governance of rural areas, rural development, and so on. But in this European project, we had the pleasure, one of the rare pleasures, to really get a project that was explicitly dedicated to cultural landscapes. And you see our mission statement here. We seek in this project to empower public and private actors to protect and sustainably manage cultural landscapes that possess significant values in cultural, historical, natural regards, and so on, at a variety of spatial scales from the local to the pan-European level. In this talk, I would give you a little bit of background and context about my understanding of cultural landscapes, and would then like to send you a few highlights of this research projects along 3 different lines. First is about the values. What is exactly the benefit, the societal value of landscapes in Europe? The second is a bit about the changes, about the dynamics of cultural landscapes in space and time, and how we tried to analyze them. And the third research point is a bit more forward-looking and action-oriented. That's more about empowering people to assume stewardship for cultural landscapes, ideas of integrated landscape management. I will tell you a little bit later what that is. And as in every presentation, I will end up with some thoughts, some conclusions, some ideas about what exactly landscape research can contribute to the wider study of sustainability in our society. When being asked what a landscape is, what is the definition of a landscape or a cultural landscape, you get a lot of different responses. There is some vagueness in the term. Some people have called that a useful vagueness, because it's maybe vague, but that also allows many different disciplines, many different people to find interest in landscapes. I usually stick to the definition of the European Landscape Convention from the Council of Europe that you see depicted here. That is quite short but powerful in my regard, and says that a landscape is an area as perceived by people. That means the perceptions of people is important. And then an area whose character is the result of action and interactions of natural and or human factors. The title of my position is Social Ecological Interactions. And you can see that this point that humans and nature are very closely interconnected in landscapes, that there are multiple interactions, relationships between ecological and social elements. That is also a very central part of the definition of landscapes in the European Landscape Convention. Here you see one framework from our project, and on the bottom, the type of dimensions of how we approach landscape research. You see a few keywords like stewardship, like driving forces showing up again. Those were a little bit the topics that we investigated in the project. And with this map on the right side, I just want to highlight that we had a number of modelers and geographers also in our team who tried to assess these different dimensions of landscape research, not only in qualitative terms, but also to get things like the value of a landscape, the diversity, the different intensities of land uses in the landscape, to get that also on maps and on the level of the European Union, plus Switzerland in our case, I have to say, because we had some Swiss partners in the project. Yeah, as diverse as the definitions of landscapes is the research community that is interested in landscapes. Here you see one kind of family tree that the Belgian geographer Mark Antrop has published some years ago. You see on the bottom the first ideas about landscapes, and then on the top the more recent ideas of landscape science. You see some famous names like Alexander von Humboldt or Karl Troll, German geographers, but also French ones like Vidal de la Plache, that were interested in landscapes. In this diversity, you could see that in the course of time and over a multitude, a really large number of disciplines and sub-disciplines and research fields, you see something like 3 different disciplinary pillars who are those that in my view until today support landscape research most intensively. On the left side, maybe you see some evolution, fields like landscape architecture planning towards spatial planning, and spatial planning is the field where landscape plays a large role until today. In the middle, you see a more biological, ecological line that led to the modern field of landscape ecology, as represented, for example, by IALE, the International Association of Landscape Ecology. And on the right side, you see this field that I understand you are mostly geography students, so that discipline that you will be most familiar with, human geography and historical geography, regional geography, and other sub-disciplines of geography have also had a long-standing interest in landscape research until today. But landscapes and cultural landscapes is not only an academic exercise, but also has high societal relevance. I mentioned already there are few policy fields that explicitly target landscapes, but if you look at European Union policies like the Common Agricultural Policy or the nature conservation directives, Natura 2000, and so on, they all take place to a very large degree in landscapes. But there are also a few policy fields where landscapes are explicitly addressed. For example, I mentioned already the European Landscape Convention of the Council of Europe. That is a relatively weak policy field, but this convention has been around for more than 20 years right now, and has influenced some fields like the practice of spatial planning, for example, quite a little bit. The EU, for example, in a so-called Charter of Rome, also has developed some interest in bringing natural and cultural aspects together in landscapes, although that also has remained a little bit vague perhaps until today. So that interestingly, it's in my view mostly the global level, the different segments, conventions, and agencies of the United Nations that actually most explicitly refer to landscape thinking. For example, the Convention on Biological Diversity has already more than 10 years ago developed the Satoyama, the so-called Satoyama initiative that tries to protect and to develop cultural landscapes and the biodiversity in them. UNESCO also through the World Heritage Convention you all know the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, I guess, has an explicit category of protection that is called cultural landscapes, and also FAO, the Agricultural and Food Organization of UN, is interested in landscape through, for example, in its GIS program on globally important agricultural heritage systems. By that, I just want to underline that with some statement from Achim Steiner, former executive director of the United Nations Environment Program, now the director of the development program of the UN, who actually called the implementation of integrated landscape management strategies a part of sustainable development strategies that are really critical to securing the future that we want. Why is there so much interest, or why has there been so much interest in landscapes in policy and society over the last 10, 15 years? Some research have attributed that to an increasing demand of our society, of our people, for the quality of our landscapes, also in amenity terms, right? You see that in every country, also in Spain, I think that with increasing development, especially people from the cities, like, yeah, a good example is always the people of Madrid and its surroundings. I feel that, right, that at the weekend, all the Madrileños are going out to the Sierra de Guadarrama and these multiple national park and the biosphere reserve, and what you find in the surroundings are buying second homes because they are interested in high quality natural and cultural landscapes. There is also a worldwide trend towards more decentralized landscape planning and policy that is responsible for the rise of cultural landscape attention. And also the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations may have a role to play, because these SDGs, the 17 development goals, with this framework, the UN emphasizes very much the interactions between these development goals, and emphasizes that we need to strive for achieving these goals together in parallel, not separately. And all that's what I want to indicate with this graph. For example, if you want to implement conserving biodiversity above water, above ground, below ground, in the water, in terrestrial realms, if you want to contribute to carbon, to climate mitigation, if you want to contribute to integrated development of our settlement areas, and so on and so forth, all that has to be thought together in landscapes. For that, you need cultural landscapes that assume and provide multiple functions and services to society. So what was the role of our research project, Hercules, in this world of cultural landscapes? We tried, as it was a research project, to generate some novelty in the approaches. Landscape research, as I said, is a very old field. Humboldt was interested in that in the 18th century. So what was our contribution? On the one hand, I mentioned already, we had a number of modelers in the project that were able to take up the increasing amount of spatial data that is available at the level of the EU from the European Environment Agency, the Copernicus project, and many other sources that are often incomplete, that are often difficult to take up. But if you have the skills, the modeling skills can be used quite well. Another approach that we introduced was to perform cross-site comparisons. We had teams in different countries of the European Union, plus Switzerland and UK, that at this time was still a member of the European Union. And we performed a series of empirical case studies at landscape scale in different landscapes, and then compared between these different places as a way to balance somehow and to bring together the local social ecological context of a local or landscape scale case study, and at the same time to derive some generalized insight at the level of the European Union. We also tried to develop and take up advances in systematic reviews, in evidence-based review techniques, and conducted a number of reviews of the literature to bring together the state of the art and to upscale landscape research that is often based on fragmented, disciplinary, localized case studies, and to generate also ideas at the level of Europe or the European Union. Finally, well, like many research projects, we try to integrate expertise both from the social and from the ecological sciences, and also from the humanities, I would actually add. So now I'm coming to the second part, where it's getting a little bit more empirical, where I want to showcase you a few of the research highlights of our group. The first 3 studies that I just very quickly in one slide each would like to present you is about the societal value of landscapes. What is actually, that's kind of the question, what do we need landscapes for? Why should society be interested in landscapes? A first qualitative answer is given again by the European Landscape Convention. Here you see some quotes that this convention emphasizes that there is an important public interest in landscapes in regards to cultural, ecological, environmental, social, and also economic effects. The convention highlights, the shared natural and cultural heritage that is found in European landscapes. And one important point that we also took up in our project is that they emphasize that landscapes are very closely related to the quality of life of people and societies in Europe. How to measure the values of a landscape? Well, there are multiple ways. Here's a nice framework that is quite complex, that when talking about values or preferences, you can assess values at the level of individual by asking individual people, or you can assess that at the level of society, for example, by so the values that act at the level of a whole society, not at the level of an individual person. You can also, that's the y-axis now, differentiate a little bit between the self-oriented and the others oriented values. That what that means is a different in the method. Self-oriented, that's maybe more the typical kind of survey, the typical interview of individual persons about their values, whereas the other oriented, that may be more a kind of workshop setting, a deliberate setting where you explore together with in group discussions the values. And then you have, of course, quantitative and qualitative approaches. And when you mix all these different dimensions together, you see that there is a multitude of different methods of how you can assess the values of landscapes. And I will come back to a few of them in a minute by highlighting 3 studies that we performed in Hercules, and also shortly after. The first, here's the topic again about the role of landscapes in people's quality of life. The second, a mapping exercise of how people perceive different landscape values. And the third one, also a mapping exercise where we try to put potential land use conflicts between different values of landscapes on a map. As for the first one, the quality of life, that was a very easy or simple but powerful exercise. Probably the oldest study that I'm going to showcase you today. Here, the research question in that study was simply, how exactly is the well-being or the quality of life of people connected to landscapes in the perception of people when you ask people? And we were also interested in different groups of or stakeholders of society, local residents in 4 study areas of Germany and of Austria, natural environments, typically surroundings of protected areas. And we compared these local resident views to those of farmers and of visitors, of tourists. We used a method that is, as I said, very simple, but how powerful, that comes from ethnography. It's called Freelisting. A very simple thing. It consists of asking many people just one simple question about, in our case, what associations do you have, or how does this local landscape actually contribute to your well-being and your quality of life? And you would typically ask people not to think too much, but just to associate, to express, and not to give lengthy answers, but just to express some short keywords, the 3 most important issues that comes to people's mind when they think about their quality of life and landscapes. You see, we then use some framework for grouping that. In the graph here on the right side, you see some from the 4 study areas in Germany and in Austria, some of the most salient answers that were given in our analysis. What you see here is that the so-called cultural ecosystem services. The cultural values play an outstanding role, and especially the practices, concrete possibilities to practice, to use, to be active in landscapes like recreational activities, depending on the landscape. That can be hiking, that can be walking, cycling, collecting natural resources like berries or mushrooms or herbal plants, angling, hunting, and so on. They're very prominent activities, besides a range of other activities and values that I cannot go into detail right now. We also found quite significant differences, especially between the farmers and the local residents. For the farmers, this being active in landscapes was even more important for the local residents. So one conclusion from this study was for us that if we want to increase human well-being and people's quality of life in the rural landscapes where they live, the material qualities of landscapes are important. We want to keep, high quality landscapes are important, but even more the questions of allowing people to enter landscapes, to be able to engage actively with landscapes is a very important issue. A second quick case about, I could talk a lot, but I will be very quick. That is a spatial mapping of landscape values through PPGIS. PPGIS is short for Public Participation Geographic Information System. Some of you may know this technique. You could say it's like a combination of a quantitative social survey in which to ask people about their values or their activities or their uses of a landscape, and that is combined with a mapping combination, a digital mapping tool where people give their answers in the form of mapping particular places in the landscape. So the question of this study was about the benefits that people actually draw from the ecosystem services of their local landscapes. We conducted surveys in 13 different landscapes across Europe. We also had three sites in Spain, one in Galicia and two in different parts of Extremadura and Cáceres in Badajoz province, with overall more than 2,000 respondents. Here you see actually that's a photo from the survey in one of our Spanish study areas. You see that we use some tablets for conducting our digital survey, and we used, for example, bars as a meeting place to find local people that we could interview. We asked about a category, a number of different ecosystem services. You see that in the legend of this map on the right side. What you get as a result is a large number of different points of different colors in the landscapes, and there are many different techniques of how to analyze that spatially and quantitatively to identify hotspots of different values in the landscape, to analyze spatial patterns, how clustered or how distributed certain values in the landscape, whether it's aesthetic values or cultural heritage values or recreational values actually are in the landscape. Just two important learnings that we took out of this exercise from the 13 landscapes was that, on the one hand, one of the most important determinants of hotspots of landscape values is, again, access to landscapes. Access as expressed, for example, in the availability of open paths or roads, also in the distance to settlements, to villages, for example, also in the availability of public lands. So that's, again, that confirms a bit our insights from the first study, that really allowing people to enter the land is really important. That was especially important, for example, in our southern or southwestern Spanish study sites, where, as you know, the latifundio model of land ownership, large private estates, is very dominant, and people often do not have so much access to the local landscapes. A second feature when overlaying our survey data with land cover data was that relatively undisturbed landscapes, that those who are further away from settlements, further away from roads, those that are protected, also have an important role for local people, especially, for example, habitat and biodiversity values or existence values. Also, I think inspirational values were put often to these relatively far away and undisturbed places in the landscape. So both well accessible parts in the landscape are important, but also maintaining undisturbed landscapes in a relatively original state does also matter to people, was our conclusion. With the third study in this area, I would like to take you to a slightly exotic place or outer place in Europe. The Faroe Islands are part of the Kingdom of Denmark, not part of the European Union. I worked for a few years at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, where I also met Aaron, and by that got some interest in these outer islands in the northern Atlantic Ocean, which are very scenic, as you can see in this photograph, but at the same time are also undergoing a very rapid economic development in different fields. There has been a very rapid increase of tourism, at least until the pandemic began, but also in fish farming, in salmon aquaculture, in hydropower development, wind power development, and all that. So there's, on the one hand, people appreciate very much the values of their natural and cultural landscapes. At the same time, there is very high development pressure. And again, we try to use our toolkit to somehow assess the potential for conflicts that might come out of these development pressures on the land. So we performed another PPGIS survey together with local collaborators from a university in these islands. We asked people about, in a more narrative, qualitative way, about the values that they attach to landscapes, but then we also asked people to map potential land use conflicts, and we did so by asking people to map points about where on these islands they would like to see more tourism development, for example, more fish farming development, more renewable energy development. And then we also asked people about places in the landscapes where they do not want to see more of these developments. And then we did some spatial analysis and based on that, try to identify hotspots of land use conflicts or of potential for land use conflicts. Hotspots in this definition would be the places where you find a lot of disagreement between people. So our assumption was that if all people would say on the southern island, we want to have more tourism development, for example, then there is no land use conflict around. But if some people say, yes, we want to have more tourists, other people say, no, we have too many tourists already, then there is a potential for land use conflicts. On these two maps on top, you see, I think that's the results on the left side for tourism, on the right side for, I think that was for wind power development, but I would have to check again. What I just want to indicate is that in yellow color, you see that some low possibility for conflicts is in many places, but that actually those places with a high potential land use conflict, those depicted in red, are actually only a few spots of the island. And we concluded from this study that actually, the potential for land use conflict is concentrated in a few islands, in a few spots of different islands, and therefore there is a possibility that they could be managed quite well through spatial planning, through landscape planning measures, just for taking some decisions of where tourism development would be prioritized, and in other places maybe where other issues could be taken more to the foreground. So some learning points in between on this area of social values. First insight was that people in Europe relate their quality of life to landscapes in very diverse ways. We later conducted this Freelisting exercise also to our full range of 13 study sites and got some confirmation. What was interesting was that the answers that we got were very diverse. We tried to fit that into the framework of ecosystem services. I suspect most of you will be familiar with this terminology, but we found that quite a few aspects that people highlighted, like the tranquility of a landscape, for example, did not very fit into the established ecosystem services category. So one learning point from that study was that we should not blind ourselves by pressing everything into expert frameworks like ecosystem services, but that such open exploratory studies can enrich in our view on the different and multiple and rich values that people attach to landscapes. But having said that, when using ecosystem services frameworks, obviously in all our studies, it was shown that cultural ecosystem services, recreation, but also the spiritual values, the heritage values, the aesthetic values of landscapes, the sense of place as expressed by landscapes, play an outstanding role in the value set of people, much more than biological values or the importance of a landscape to produce food or timber, for example. Yeah, but this diversity of values is, on the one hand, certainly something that we should appreciate, but on the other hand, Europe is a relatively small continent. We have a diversity of values. We have quite intensive land use, and in many parts of Europe, we have small-scale patterns of land use or landscape units, which together leads to multiple land use conflicts. And as I just showed you in the last example, public participation GIS might be able to identify hotspots of values, but also of conflicts around landscapes, and may give some pointers that could be taken up in spatial planning efforts to mitigate some of these conflicts. Now I'm coming to my second area of highlights, the question of landscape change. Again, a quick look for getting us started in what the European Landscape Convention says about change and dynamics. If you look in, as you see in this quote, the convention also observes an accelerated transformation of landscapes and mentions a number of sectors of also of business fields that may be responsible for such accelerated transformation of landscape, like farming, forestry, industry, mineral extraction, but also some fields of planning, tourism development. Here we have it again, and economic changes at large are also mentioned. A few ways of how we assessed landscape change in the European context. Here, a first exercise again from our modelers. As I suspect most of you are geographers, you may be aware that it has been a long-standing theme in geography and other disciplines to come up with a map of European landscapes. There are different maps. Most of them have been drawn more based on intuition. Some have also been based on data, but they all have struggled with taking up somehow the complexity of land use and land cover in the European context. So our modelers had the ambition in this project to come up with a data-based map of land use or land systems, as they called it in this paper, at the level of the European Union, that both integrates land cover, but also the different intensities of land use in Europe, because like in the case of grazing, for example, some low intensity grazing and some super intensive dairy farming system are two completely different things with completely different aspects of landscape. So the intensity of land use, as expressed, for example, in the number of animals grazing in a landscape, is quite important. Based on a number of different European data sets, our modelers use some technique called self-organizing maps, including a total of 12 different indicators of land cover, but also intensity of land use. And in an interpretation through experts in several workshops, we came up with 15 what we call archetypes of dominant land systems in Europe. And here you see our map. It's quite complex and maybe not so intuitive at a quick look, but if you go deeper in it, it's actually quite expressive, as I find. You see, for example, in red, these are the intensive crop cultivation areas of Europe. You see like almost the whole country of Denmark falls into that, many parts of northwestern Germany, also of the Netherlands, of northern France, of parts of England, and so on. Whereas on the other hand, in the Mediterranean area, you see, for example, in pink, these are the permanent crop areas like olives and maybe mainly and other tree crops. You see in what's this color called in English? I'm not quite sure. That would be more the low intensity grazing areas like the Dehesas of Spain. You find other systems of grazing also in the other parts of the Mediterranean basin. In contrast, in Ireland and in the western part of England, you see in darker blue the more intensive livestock grazing systems, mainly focused on dairy. In Scandinavia, you see, for example, forests of low management intensity in the north in light green, and in dark green you see in southern Sweden, as you see also, for example, in parts of northern Portugal and Spain, or in the I think that's the Bordeaux area of France, very intensively managed forestry plantations. We also created a similar map of landscape changes at the level of Europe based on the same data sets from different time steps. We also found some spatial patterns, good accessibility, topographic, climatic, and soil conditions, for example, were closely related to the more intensively managed landscapes on our map. Second thing is an example of our cross-site comparison, a paper led by Matthias Bürgi that Aaron also knows. Well, here we were more interested in the processes that are responsible for landscape change. That was carried out in 6 study areas, as I said, taking a longer perspective, building based on topographic maps from the 1815s until around 2012. As we were mostly interested in processes, in drivers of landscape changes, we combined the analysis of GIS, of how the landscape had changed, with oral history approaches, where we interviewed in these 6 areas elderly people who had observed, who had a role in land management, who had been farmers, for example, or foresters, and who had observed changes in the landscape in their own lifetime and had heard about changes in their family. We were then interested and also did some spatial analysis about the dimensions, the directions, and the speed of change in the landscapes. But as I said, we're more interested actually in the drivers of change. And what you see on this graph on the left side is a complexity of different processes that we found in different time steps, also in the different study areas. I won't go into detail like that. That just indicates that there is a diversity of processes taking place. But what we found quite interesting, that kind of the more indirect drivers that are responsible for triggering changes in the landscape are very often in different parts of Europe very similar. And we narrowed that actually down to some kind of top 5 dominant driving forces. The first one was the development of infrastructures like road infrastructure or the building of railroads, for example. The second most important factor that was relevant in our study areas were political changes. A good example may be the breakdown of the Iron Curtain at the end of the 1980s, right? And the entry of many Eastern European states into the European Union that had triggered quite dramatic changes also in landscapes in the following years. The job market, the emergence of industries is another important driving force. And in Spain, of course, you also find many cases of land abandonment in mountain areas like the Pyrenees, for example, that was triggered by depopulation of people, as many people left the farming sectors, migrated out of rural areas into cities, to Barcelona or even abroad, to take up jobs in industry or in the services elsewhere. Technological innovation in farming, in forestry, land consolidation, and so on is also an important driver. And finally, we saw, at least in our Swiss study set, that also climate change has become an important driver of landscape changes. A last example in this area, And let me have a look at the time. I already come to an end soon. I will try to speed up a little bit. The driving forces, that was a systematic review exercise where, again, we tried to take up the fragmented knowledge of localized case studies to generate some insights over the driving forces of landscape change in Europe. We introduced some typology. On top are the more direct causes of landscape change. Below are the more underlying, more abstract drivers. And to make a long story short, one interesting insight from that systematic review was that land abandonment actually was by far the most frequently identified driving force of landscape change in the studies that we had evaluated. So we argued that land abandonment, the giving up of land, taking land up out of production and all, is a factor that is somehow a bit neglected at global level and also in Europe. At European level, we are always talking about intensification of land use, about the intensity of modern farming and so on, and are neglecting a little bit that, especially in the mountain areas in many parts of Eastern Europe, but also in many parts of the Mediterranean, that we find also the counter process of land abandonment, and should dedicate maybe more energy to this process. We also found quite frequently in the study that many processes and drivers occurred at the same place. For example, that in some landscape we find intensification and extensification or abandonment of land use taking place very close to each other. So a polarization of land uses could be observed quite frequently. And for these more abstract political, economic, cultural drivers, we found that there are some sets of combined drivers that are powerful, and that these combinations actually are maybe more important than looking at just an individual variable of these drivers. So here, again, in quick, our interim conclusions. Yeah, well, landscapes have always been dynamic, but as I mentioned already, the rates of change are increasing, are accelerating in our time. There is a large variety of different processes taking place in the different landscapes of Europe, but while there are these specificities at regional scale, there are also quite some surprisingly similar baselines, maybe in consequence of joint policies like the common agricultural policy that is affecting more or less all agricultural landscapes in Europe. I mentioned land abandonment as an important point, and the polarization also. So let me quickly move on to the last area. I said this is the forward-looking part of our Hercules project, where we explored the role of civil society, again taking up some of the messages from the European Landscape Convention that highlights that the public actually has a strong wish to enjoy landscapes of high quality, but that people and the public also wants to play an active part in the development, in taking decisions about landscapes. So the point of landscape as a commons, the role of cooperation in landscapes, of participating people in decisions about landscape, is something that is highlighted in the European Landscape Convention, and we tried to take that up research-wise in a few initiatives. And I quickly jump again through these three initiatives, studies that we performed. The first was the notion of integrated landscape initiative or integrated landscape management. That is the term that the UN is promoting worldwide as a way of reducing land use conflicts. We were interested in how integrated landscape initiatives actually look like in Europe. Our definition of an integrated landscape initiative was that it was a bottom-up, local level initiative that takes different fields or interests, that brings different interests in landscapes together. So, for example, yeah, you see here some activists managing a traditional orchard meadow somewhere in Germany. This is an initiative that is interested, yeah, in producing local food based on local tradition, but at the same time also has an interest in the biodiversity values of the landscape, and by that would be a landscape initiative. Below you see an initiative from Romania that tries to preserve cultural heritage features, but at the same time is also interested in yeah, in bringing that together with biodiversity conservation, developing tourism. So therefore it would also be in our sense an integrated landscape initiative. We performed a review on the internet, an online survey of such initiatives. We found thousands of such initiatives in all countries of Europe, then focused on a small set of these initiatives and tried to understand the organizational forms, the actors in these initiatives, yeah, the key to success, and also the barrier that these were that these had to overcome, and so on, and published that in a small study. Again, to make it very short, yeah, there is a large number of initiatives that have a very holistic understanding of landscapes. So they really look at different values, different aspects of landscapes, typically have very diverse aims, also bring in multiple actors from different sectors of society at multiple scales, from local to national levels, typically, often being focused on awareness raising and societal learning. So that was really an awakening moment for our project, that although, yeah, these initiatives act at local scale and are often overlooked, that actually there is a lot of interest and a lot of action going on in civil society in Europe for landscapes already today. The second exercise was a bit more specifically focused on the role of food, how regional or local food products can foster the sustainability or the preservation of landscapes. That was a so-called solution scanning workshop that we carried out together with Japanese colleagues from the Satoyama initiative that I mentioned before, where we compared different models on how to generate added values for traditional products or place-based food networks, as we called it in this study, in landscapes. You see on the left, on the right side, a few of such models of how that could look like. We compared as a shared learning effort between Japanese ideas and explored which of these could be taken over to Europe and the other way around. In Europe, initiatives are a bit stronger of fostering biodiversity conservation and socio-cultural traditions in landscapes. In Japan, especially nutrition and health as related to these products is a bit more into the foreground. We identified some features that are important when you want to promote or support landscapes through such local products, short supply chains to ensure trust and transparency, local production standards, certification through geographic indication labels, for example, can play a role. Connecting food with place-based skills, recipes, breeds, varieties, diets, and so on. All that has been considered important. There are, of course, also certain trade-offs, but I will shorten a little bit. The last one, but that really, as my time is over already, very, very short, we were also interested in public policies, for example, in the agri-environmental schemes of the Common Agricultural Policy, and to see how public policies, public support programs could actually support action or stewardship for landscapes. We did that by asking farmers in a study area in the UK. Again, at that time, they were still part of the European Union. What was interesting in that regard is that although usually we expect that when asking farmers, they would always complain and just say that they need more subsidies, that they need more money. Actually, why more subsidies were mentioned, but actually other factors were mentioned much more frequently in regard to the needs that land managers or farmers have in regard to the design of public policies that would enable them to do landscape stewardship. For example, joint learning, that farmers and agency people would be put together that to create a joint understanding of the concerns and the preferences of land managers. That was frequently highlighted. Also, more flexible schemes that farmers can experiment with different management practices was a frequently expressed need, and also the wish to collaborate across farm levels to bring different actors together in landscapes were points that were quite frequently mentioned by our farmers. So here are a few interim conclusions on the role of landscapes in civil society. We have an active community practicing integrated landscape management in Europe. There are ways how that could be further supported by public policies, but our public policies, like in the GAP, are not very good until now actually to support collective action at the landscape scale. Most of the funds that are being paid in the Common Agricultural Policy are paid directly to individual farmers, not at the level of communities at landscape level, and that is a problem. How to integrate the local knowledge to support landscapes remains an important task, and there were also a few open questions, given that, for example, we live in the era of urbanization with ever more urban people. How can we support a commitment to landscape stewardship also across geographic distances? How can also urban people foster rural landscapes? What is the role of market mechanisms? How can they interplay the responsibility between the state and the engagement of civil society work, and so on? With that, I think I'm on my last slide already. Famous question in research from reviewers, for example, is often this very short "so what" question. Why is landscape research actually important? In our project, we try to give a few answers of how landscape research, as our community performs it, can inform also the wider sustainability. The wider discussion on sustainability. A first point is that in landscapes, in cultural landscapes, people are an integral part. Often we are complaining that people are decoupled from nature. In landscapes, you have people and nature. By that, landscape research, landscape thinking actually can bring people and nature together quite nicely. In terms of methods, our second point was that landscape research can provide fine-grade but also large-scale information of landscape change, which may be quite useful also for studying, assessing sustainability in a wider sense. A third point, I didn't go so far into landscape history in this presentation. We also had archaeologists in our project, and we argue that a lot of our sustainability questions are now very well rooted in the present, sometimes also in the future, but we do not think so far into history, and the toolkit and the theoretical set of landscape history offer some way of maybe also making insights from history useful for today and for the future of our society. Yeah, finally, yeah, well, all these drivers and processes are also relevant for sustainability in a larger sense. Landscape values, I talked a lot about landscape values. You could say values are generally recognized as a very deep, a very powerful leverage point for society. Therefore, understanding and maybe also changing the values of people can be quite important also to trigger action for more sustainability. And finally, our work on landscape stewardship on civil society may offer some insights on self-organization of communities, on stakeholder participation, also in a larger sense. I end my presentation with a quote from a policy brief that is already a bit old, but still valid, from the European Science Foundation, that 12 years ago stated that actually all the big grand challenges that our societies are facing today have some embedding in landscape, whether you look at climate change, energy needs, health, safety, food security, urbanization, migration, all the big topics somehow have a relation to landscapes. And in my regard, it is important to address these topics also at the level of landscapes. With that, I thank you for your attention. You see here some outputs from our project. There was a book, Science and Practice of Landscape Stewardship, in case you are more deeply interested. We also had 2 special issues that came out of this project, in landscape ecology and landscape research. And we also have a website that is still active. I'm not sure the link is here. But I think it was in one of my earlier slides. It's hercules-landscapes.eu, where you can find also a lot of information on this project, in case you are interested. So thank you so much, and I close now my screen, and I'm open for questions and discussions. Aaron, do you want me to stop the recording now, or should I also record the discussion?